There is a story still told in parts of Warren County about a photograph, though I've never spoken to anyone who claims to have actually held it. 4 men stand in front of a hunting lodge in the fall of 1924, rifles slung, grinning the way men grin when they still believe the worst thing that can happen to them is a long walk back to camp. 3 of those men were never seen again. The 4th man, as the story goes, is the one who took the photograph, and he wasn't part of the hunting party at all. He was part of the search team sent in 2 weeks later to find them. According to every version of the tale, when that roll of film was finally developed, 60 miles from where any of it happened, the photograph was dated 3 days before that 4th man says he ever set foot in the woods. I can't tell you whether that detail is true. Photographs like that have a way of attaching themselves to stories like this one, whether they ever existed or not. What I can tell you is that it's the detail that pulled me into this case, and it survived 100 years of retelling, however much any single version of it can be trusted. What follows is my attempt to piece together what's known, from local accounts, a handful of letters, and one long recollection attributed to a forest ranger who worked the search, as honestly as those sources allow. Some of it holds together. Some of it contradicts itself depending on who's doing the telling. I'll try to be clear about which as we go. Now, to understand why people are still telling a story about a dead man's own photograph a century later, we need to start where it begins. The Adirondacks in October of 1924 were still wild enough that a man could walk 2 days from the nearest township and not cross another human footprint. Hollis Bramwell was 34. A timber assessor from Glens Falls who'd hunted that country every autumn since he was a boy. By most descriptions, he wasn't a reckless man. He kept a running record of weather patterns and game trails going back a decade, and the men who hunted with him trusted his judgment more than their own instincts. That year he brought his younger brother Walt, a quiet man who'd come back from the war, changed in ways nobody discussed directly, and a friend of theirs named Ezra Coulton, a schoolteacher who'd never fired a rifle at anything larger than a tin can and made no secret of being nervous about the trip. They planned 6 days. Hollis packed for 8 because he always packed for 2 extra, a habit, he liked to say, from a season years earlier when an early snow nearly killed him. They hired a local guide, a Mohawk trapper named Louis Otis Beaupre, who knew the ridgeline above Panther Creek better than anyone alive, and who, by his own account, almost turned the job down. He said the creek had a bad name among the older trappers. Not haunted, not cursed, nothing that dramatic in his telling. Just a place where, over the years, a disproportionate number of things had gone wrong. A drowning sometime around the turn of the century. 2 men who got turned around overnight despite clear skies and a compass between them. Livestock that spooked for no visible reason when driven along the western bank. Beaupre said his own grandfather wouldn't camp there, and that he only took the job because Hollis paid well, and because, in his words, educated men don't listen to old men's warnings. So there wasn't much point arguing. If you find old cases like this one as unsettling as I do, consider subscribing to Haunted Roots. The first 4 days went the way most hunting trips go. Good weather, one missed shot at a buck that Walt apparently complained about for years afterward, and the ordinary friction of 4 different men sharing a small camp. Ezra struggled with the cold. Beaupre found him tiresome but capable enough. Hollis kept up his usual notes. Nothing in the way this part of the story is told suggests anyone expected trouble. The change, when it came, was small enough that on its own it wouldn't have meant anything. On the 5th night, Beaupre said he woke to what sounded like someone calling his name from past the tree line, in a voice that sounded almost, not quite, but almost like Hollis's. Hollis was asleep 6 feet away. Beaupre didn't wake him. He assumed, reasonably enough, that he'd half-dreamed it, or that sound was carrying strangely off the water, which it can do easily enough in that kind of terrain. The next morning, Ezra mentioned, almost as a joke, that he'd heard someone whistling a specific little tune his father used to whistle while doing chores, a private thing. As far as he knew, that nobody else in that camp could have possibly known. He laughed it off. Nobody pressed him. It's worth saying plainly that neither of these things, taken alone, means much of anything. Sound plays tricks in mountain terrain. Memory plays tricks on tired, cold men a long way from home. If the story stopped there, it wouldn't be worth telling. It didn't stop there. On the 6th day, the day they'd planned to break camp, Beaupre found tracks along the creek bank he said he couldn't place. Not bear by his account, the stride was wrong for it. Not deer or moose either. He didn't tell the others it unsettled him. He told them it was probably nothing, but let's move camp higher up before dark, just to be safe. Hollis, ever the planner, agreed without much argument. Ezra didn't ask why. Walt, by that point in the trip, mostly didn't say anything at all. That was the last night any of the 4 men were together and accounted for. What comes after this depends on how the story's been passed down, and the fullest version of it traces back to Beaupre's own account, given some time after he walked out alone, though exactly how faithfully that account has been preserved through a century of retelling isn't something I can promise you. By his telling, sometime after midnight, he heard his name called again, this time from 2 directions at once. Hollis's voice, it seemed, from the east side of camp, and almost simultaneously from the west, Ezra's voice, using a nickname that only Hollis used for him, one Ezra had never once used in 6 days together. Beaupre says he woke Hollis to ask if he'd called out. Hollis said no. Both men then heard the voice again. Still using that nickname, and by Beaupre's account, whatever showed on Hollis's face in that moment told him more than any explanation could have. What Beaupre did next isn't in every version of the story, but it's in enough of them that I think it's worth including, if only because it's the most human moment in the entire account. He didn't run. He didn't immediately wake the others. By his own admission, some clear-thinking part of him wanted proof before panic. So he called out a name, not Ezra's, not Walt's, a name that belonged to nobody in that camp, an uncle back home nobody there had ever met. If the voice really was only an echo of memory bouncing strangely off the water, it wouldn't answer to a stranger's name. If it was simply repeating whatever it happened to hear closest, it might answer to that too. He says it never repeated the name he made up. It kept using Ezra's nickname correctly every time, as if it already knew which words would work and had no interest in the ones that wouldn't. They woke Walt and Ezra. All 4 men were now awake, all 4 accounted for, and the voice kept calling, moving, in Beaupre's telling, in a way that didn't track with how sound naturally travels through timber. Uphill one moment, then somewhere that should have taken minutes to reach on foot the next. I want to be honest here. This part of the story rests on one man's recollection of a genuinely frightening night, filtered through however many retellings it's passed through since. Memory under that kind of stress is unreliable by nature, and grief reshapes a story over time, whether anyone means it to or not. I'm not asking you to take it as settled fact. I'm telling you what's been passed down, and what came next is harder to wave away. By that same account, Ezra, the least experienced woodsman of the 3, the one who'd struggled with the cold and the dark from the first night, was the one who wanted to leave immediately, on foot, in the dark. Hollis argued against it. Walt uncharacteristically sided with Ezra. Beaupre made the call to wait for first light and moved together, staying close and quiet. He apparently spent the rest of his life saying that decision was the one he couldn't forgive himself for. Sometime before dawn, exhausted past the point of resisting it, Beaupre fell asleep, sitting upright against a pack. When he woke, the sky was grey, the fire had burned to coals, and he was alone. There was no sign of a struggle, which is one detail that stayed consistent across every telling. The tents were still standing. All 3 rifles were still leaning against the same log from the night before. For 3 hunters, even inexperienced ones, to leave their guns behind in unfamiliar wilderness is close to unthinkable. Ezra's boots sat by the fire. Whatever happened, it didn't happen the way an animal attack happens, and it didn't happen the way 3 panicked men running for their lives would leave a camp either. It happened the way a camp looks when the people in it simply stopped being in it, Beaupre said. He searched for 2 days before making the 11-mile walk out to raise the alarm, a delay some in town quietly criticized afterward, given that 3 men were already missing in wilderness that could kill an unprepared traveler in a matter of days. He never fully explained the 2 days, beyond saying once, "I kept hearing them, close, then far, then close again. I thought if I waited long enough, one of them would find his way back to the fire." None of them did. The search party that formed out of Glens Falls and the surrounding townships numbered 9 men, including a forest ranger named Aldous Ferry. And it's Ferry's account, however it's reached us across the years, that gives us the most detail about what happened next. By every description, he wasn't a superstitious man. He'd spent 15 years handling timber disputes and lost hiker recoveries, and the way his part of the story is usually told reads like a competent professional doing a difficult job in bad terrain. Not a man looking to embellish anything. They found the abandoned high camp roughly where Beaupre had described it. The details matched his account closely: the rifles, the boots, the cold fire pit. One detail Beaupre either hadn't noticed or hadn't mentioned was added by Ferry's side of the story, cut into the bark of a birch tree at the edge of camp, at a height none of the 3 missing men could have reached without climbing. Were 3 sets of initials, HB, WB, EC, carved cleanly. In a hand none of the search party recognized as belonging to any of the men they were looking for. The way Ferry's part of the story is told, he didn't offer any theory about what that meant. He simply noted it, the depth of the cuts, the height off the ground, and moved on in the same flat procedural tone that runs through the rest of his account. I find that restraint more unsettling than if the story had him speculating wildly. A trained, skeptical man looked at something he couldn't explain, and as far as we know, chose to describe it plainly instead of making sense of it for us. The search continued for 4 more days. This is where the story thins out and starts to vary more, depending on who tells it. Because what survives from here comes mostly from the recollections of 2 search party members, given separately and years apart, that mostly, but not entirely, agree with each other. Both versions describe the same pattern the original party experienced: familiar-sounding voices at night, calling from directions and distances that didn't add up. One searcher, a younger man remembered as Otto Reinhold, is said to have heard his late father's voice call his name on the 3rd night out, a detail that gets mentioned without much elaboration, beyond the fact that he asked to walk point rather than rear position the following day. Whether that was fear, grief, or something else entirely, nobody seems to have asked him directly, or if they did, it hasn't come down to us. On the 2nd night after they found the high camp, 3 of the men reported hearing someone call out a headcount, the exact clipped rhythm Ferry used every evening to account for his party, name after name in the same order he always used. The first reaction, by every account, wasn't fear. It was mild annoyance. Someone assumed one of the men had wandered off post and was calling back the roll as a joke, and 2 searchers actually answered by shouting his name, expecting him to step out of the tree line sheepish and cold. He didn't, because he'd been sitting at the fire the entire time. When the count came again, it was still in Ferry's rhythm, still in his cadence, but it moved past the names of everyone present and kept going, reciting 2 more names that matched no one in either camp. One of the men, without saying why out loud, tried the same trick Beaupre had tried on that first ridge years earlier, though as far as anyone could tell, he'd never heard Beaupre's account and had no way of knowing to attempt it. He called out a name that wasn't in the search party, wasn't on Ferry's roster, wasn't anyone's father or brother back home. Nothing answered to it. The rhythm went quiet after that, at least for the rest of the night, though nobody could say for certain whether it stopped, because the trick worked, or because the fire had simply burned low enough that everyone quietly gave up listening. Ferry, by the account of the men who were with him, didn't say much about it that night. He's remembered doing what he always did, checking the fire, checking the supplies, writing something down by lamplight before he'd let anyone sleep, as if the simple act of recording it made it smaller. It's a small detail, but it's the one that makes him feel most like a real person in this story, rather than a name attached to a report. A careful man reaching for the only tool he had, which was procedure, because procedure was the only thing that had ever worked for him before. Not everyone wanted to keep going after that. Reinhold, oddly, was among those pushing hardest to press on, as though finding something now mattered more to him than it had before. It was one of the older trappers on the team, who argued they should pull back to the township and wait for more men and better weather. And by most tellings, it wasn't a shouting match, just two tired, frightened men disagreeing quietly over a dying fire while the others pretended not to listen. Ferry sided with continuing, though the story doesn't say he did it with much confidence, on what would become the search party's last full night in that section of forest. They made a decision, several of them apparently second-guessed for the rest of their lives. With an early snow expected to close the search window, they split into two smaller groups to cover more ground. Ferry led one group of 5. A local guide named Whitcomb led the other 4. They agreed to meet back at a fixed point by early afternoon. Whitcomb's group never arrived. Ferry's side of the story is careful here, almost clinical, and I think that carefulness matters more than any summary of it could. By his account, his group waited 3 hours past the agreed time before backtracking along the route Whitcomb's party had planned to take. They found the trail. At one point along it, they found a single boot standing upright in the middle of the path, laces still tied, as though someone had simply stepped out of it without disturbing its position. They found no other trace of Whitcomb or the 3. And with him, the remaining 5 searchers made the decision to abandon the operation and return to town, a call Ferry is said to have believed was correct for the rest of his life. Whatever judgment history may pass on it, an early snowfall 2 days later effectively closed off the area until spring. When a smaller follow-up party went back the following May, they found no further trace of Hollis, Walt, Ezra, or Whitcomb's group. Beaupre, for his part, never guided in that section of the Adirondacks again, and by most accounts wouldn't discuss the case at all afterward, except once, to a nephew who later said Beaupre told him only that some places aren't lost country. They're keeping country. They keep what they take. 13 men went into those woods that autumn, across the 2 separate parties. 6 of them came out. What took the other 7, 3 hunters and a 4-man half of a search team sent to find them, has never really been explained in this telling or any other I've come across. There's no physical evidence to point to, no bodies recovered, nothing beyond a boot left standing on an empty trail, and 3 sets of initials cut higher than any of the missing men could have reached on their own. What's left is a pattern that shows up, with uncomfortable consistency, across a number of similar stories from that era and that part of the country. Familiar voices calling from distances that don't add up. Camps left behind without a struggle. And survivors who tend to agree, however they phrase it, that whatever was out there wasn't hunting them so much as calling them patiently by name. I've read enough about how sound moves through mountain terrain to know there are real, physical explanations that could account for pieces of this. Certain valley formations do produce infrasound under specific wind conditions. Low-frequency vibration below what the ear consciously registers, and there's a well-documented tendency for tired, frightened people to mishear ordinary noise as speech, especially speech they're already primed to expect. I don't dismiss any of that. It's the more responsible explanation, and if this were a single account from a single night, I'd lean on it entirely. What I can't fully explain away is the discrimination in it. The fact that by every telling it never answered to a name it hadn't already heard, never mimicked a voice nobody in the party recognized. Coincidence can explain a single night. It strains a good deal harder to explain 2. 10 years and roughly 40 miles apart, behaving the same specific, selective way, I don't know what happened in those woods above Panther Creek in the autumn of 1924. And I'd be lying if I told you I thought anyone ever would. But the story is still told, however imperfectly. However many versions of it have drifted from each other over 100 years. And somewhere in it, if you believe any part of it at all, there's a photograph of 4 men smiling outside a hunting lodge. And one of them, by his own account, wasn't there when it was taken.